Hello, I am Nicole Polachek, and I welcome you to Homeless on the Prairie, a podcast on housing insecurity in Saskatoon. The housing crisis in Saskatoon is a wicked problem that is affecting our collective well-being as individuals and community. This podcast is brought to you by the Community University Institute for Social Research, CUSAR. The hope of this podcast is to share our findings from two studies assessing housing in Canada and Saskatoon in particular, called A Safe and Affordable Place to Call Home, a multidisciplinary longitudinal outcomes analysis of the National Housing Strategy. The principal investigators of which at Carleton University are Drs. Liam O'Brien and Jackie Kennelly. The CUSAR researchers and co-applicants are Dr. Isabel M. Finley with the Edwards Schools of Business, and Dr. Nazim Mahajareen, the College of Medicine, and Professor Sarah Buehler, College of Law. Dr. Finley is the theme lead for the health, social, and economic outcomes of the National Housing Strategy. And the second, called People, Places, Policies, Prospects, Affordable Rental Housing for Those in Greatest Need, a 3-site national study led in Cape Breton Regional Municipality by PI Dr. Catherine Leventing-Reid, Cape Breton University, in Ottawa by Dr. Jacqueline Kennelly, Carleton University, and in Saskatoon by Dr. Isabel M. Finley. Both of these partnered research studies are funded by SSHRC CMHC, which we acknowledge with gratitude. We want to acknowledge that we live and work on Treaty 6 territory, traditional gathering place and traveling route for Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, Nakota, and Dakota Sioux, who played key roles in what we now call Saskatoon. Where we are is at the heart of who we are, our obligations and opportunities as treaty beneficiaries, sharing the land, and so much else. We respect our ancestors and cherish our relationships with one another as we work better together on a journey to improve housing. For our first episode, we will introduce and define homelessness and housing insecurity and take a deep dive into homelessness in Saskatoon. I will be joined by a special guest, Kenechekwu Onike, who will discuss his work on evictions and its role in housing issues. Before we dive into homelessness and housing insecurity in Saskatoon, first, let's take a moment to ask, what is homelessness and housing insecurity? Homelessness in particular can be a common yet daunting word. We have all heard it before and all have our perceptions of homelessness. But what does it mean, and who is impacted? The definition of homelessness from the Oxford Dictionary is, quote, the state of having no settled home, end quote. If we take a moment to think about this definition doesn't give us a lot of information. This broad definition may seem simple enough, however, many organizations and governments expand on it to develop a more precise understanding of homelessness. Having a more precise definition could lead to a better understanding of who is experiencing homelessness. The Canadian Observatory on Homelessness produced a document defining homelessness in Canada. They define homelessness as a range where, quote, without any shelter at one end and being insecurely housed at the other, end quote. The extreme end, without any shelter, is also known as absolute homelessness. This is where people are living on the streets, whereas someone at the other end could be insecurely housed but not living on the streets. In the past, whenever I thought of someone who's experiencing homelessness, I always pictured someone, usually a white adult male, alone living on the streets. This image has been ingrained in me since I was a child, and is often how homelessness is depicted in the media. Today, when we think of homelessness, we may think of people living in encampments, as it's a much more visible form of homelessness. This image would fall into the absolute homelessness end of the spectrum. But the image doesn't include the other side of the spectrum and everything in between. Homelessness is a complex issue, and its complexity is identified in Canada's typology of homelessness. unsheltered, emergency sheltered, provisionally accommodated, and risk of homelessness. This typology of homelessness includes those experiencing absolute homelessness, but also includes people living in various emergency sheltered, or in some sort of temporary housing, provisionally accommodated. The latter, temporary housing / provisionally accommodated, often called couch surfing, and is referred to as hidden homelessness, where individuals stay with families and friends but have no ongoing access to secure and stable housing. Lastly, Canada also includes at-risk individuals in their typology. Here are people who may have housing, but due to their circumstances, whether it be economic, health, or other reasons, people may be at higher risk of experiencing homelessness. This ties into the next definition, housing insecurity. Housing insecurity is, quote, where a person's housing is unstable, unsafe, unaffordable, or unsustainable, end quote. And that quote is from the Advanced Healthcare Administration. In addition to the document that defines homelessness in Canada, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness published another document written by Jesse A. Thrissold called Definition of Indigenous Homelessness. Thrissold states that, quote, unlike the common colonialist definition of homelessness, Indigenous homelessness is not defined as a lack of structure of habitation. Rather, it is more fully described and understood through the composite lens of Indigenous worldviews. Additionally, Thrissold continues to explain that Indigenous homelessness is, quote, best understood as the outcome of historically constructed and ongoing settler colonialization and racism that have displaced and dispossessed First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from their traditional governance systems and laws, territories, histories, worldviews, ancestors, and stories, end quote. Thrissold stresses that the root of Indigenous homelessness is the intergenerational trauma, racism, discrimination, all of which are entrenched in Canadian society that are, quote, producing impenetrable systemic and societal barriers such as a lack of affordable and appropriate housing, insufficient and culturally inappropriate health and education services, irrelevant and inadequate employment opportunities, and a crumbling infrastructure in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, end quote. This document breaks down Indigenous homelessness in 12 dimensions of Indigenous homelessness. Now that we have a better understanding of homelessness and housing insecurity, let's explore what it looks like in our community. First, let's look at how homelessness in Saskatoon is measured. In 2008, the Community University Institute for Social Research, QSAR, did the first count of Saskatoon's homeless population. Point-in-time counts are a collaborative effort where volunteers, outreach teams, facilities, and programs work together to try to create a snapshot of homelessness in Saskatoon in a given point of time. The count back in 2008 reported 260 individuals experiencing homelessness. From 2008 to 2024, QSAR had continued to lead the point-in-time counts. From these results, we can see that housing insecurity and homelessness is a rapidly increasing issue facing our community as Saskatoon navigates a housing crisis. In 2022, for example, the point-in-time count reported 550 individuals experiencing homelessness. By the 2024 point-in-time count, this number had increased to 1,499. This is a huge jump. And in the most recent 2025 point-in-time count reported 1,931 individuals experiencing homelessness. This number is a 251% increase since 2022 and is the highest reported number in Saskatoon's history. Now, let's just take a second to think about this number and put it into perspective. On March 2nd, CTV News posted an article stating how Saskatoon's homeless population is now around the same size as the town of Watrous. This is huge. Not only has Saskatoon's homeless population grown by 251% since 2022, but is now roughly the same size as other towns in Saskatchewan. The point-in-time counts also breaks down where these individuals were counted. In the 2025 count, 37.5% were unsheltered, 12.3% were experiencing hidden homelessness, 7.8% were in encampments, 17% were in emergency shelters, 23% transitional housing, and 2.4% were in health systems or correctional facilities. Those living in encampments and emergency shelters have increased. The 2024 count also reported that the number of encampments tripled from 2023, and from the 2025 counts, we can just see that it continues to increase. These numbers are high, but it's important to remember that there are real people with real experiences behind the numbers. When we view statistics, numbers, and percentages, it can be easy to distance ourselves from the situation or forget what these numbers truly mean. These are people, families, friends, children who are experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity. It is a human issue. Thus, it's important to remember the humans behind the statistic. In Canada, we have a right to adequate housing, yet this right is not being met in our community, and supports are not targeting those in greatest need. Not all communities are equally impacted by the homelessness crisis, as Indigenous peoples are disproportionately impacted. 90.1% in 2022, 80.7% in 2024, and 82.9% in 2025. This means that in 2022, 9 out of 10 individuals experiencing homelessness identified as Indigenous, and 8 out of 10 in 2024 and 2025. This statistic is high on its own, but it's important to understand this within the larger context of Saskatoon's general population. Indigenous individuals make up 11.5% of Saskatoon's population, yet make up 82.9% of the homeless population. This overrepresentation illustrates colonialism's ongoing impacts, and as the city of Saskatoon states, quote, "This persistent overrepresentation reflects systemic inequalities that require targeted solutions," end quote. Additionally, the percentages of children and youth found in these point-in-time counts are also disturbing. 20% in 2022, 32.71% in 2024, and 24% in 2025. This means there were 315 children and 175 youths experiencing homelessness in 2024, and 219 children and 209 youths in 2025. The average class size for elementary schools in Saskatoon is 25. This means that there are almost 9 classrooms of children experiencing homelessness in 2025, and almost 13 classrooms for 2024. While these numbers of children experiencing homelessness has decreased from the 2024 report, it's still a huge concern that children and youth are experiencing homelessness in our community. Without a Home, the National Youth Homelessness Survey by Gatz et al. Found that most youths in Canada who were experiencing homelessness had their first episode of homelessness before the age of 16. They also found that, quote, "Those who leave the home at an early age are more likely to experience multiple episodes of homelessness, be involved with children protective services, be tested for ADHD, experience bullying, be victims of crime once homeless, including sexual assault, have a greater mental health and addiction symptoms, experience poorer quality of life, attempt suicide, become chronically homeless," end quote. Thus, the children and youth experiencing homelessness in Saskatoon increases their risk of multiple experiences of homelessness. Additionally, for both the 2024 and 2025 point-in-time counts, 1.7% of the individuals experiencing homelessness in Saskatoon are seniors, aged 65 and up. This has increased since the 2022, which saw 0.9% were seniors. In the 2024 point-in-time report, it was reported that seniors were the highest demographic using shelters, whereas youth were the highest to report not using shelters. On the Homeless Hub website, they explain how homelessness among seniors could be caused by financial or health reasons and limited access to affordable units. They also explain that their risk of homelessness can also increase by experience the death of a spouse or experiences of discrimination. While there are few homelessness services slash supports specifically for seniors, there can also be a lack of knowledge there can also be a lack of knowledge of these services and supports, as well as other benefits that these individuals might be eligible for. This is supported by research findings from this ongoing study, as research found that accessibility gaps for seniors and individuals living with disabilities. But how did we get here? In addition to the point-in-time counts from 2008 to 2024, QSAR also was the research lead for the city's 2024 Housing Needs Assessment. This report was published in 2025 by the City of Saskatoon and identifies prominent housing issues that the city faces. The current housing market has not been able to adjust to the needs of a growing population. Simultaneously, rent continues to rise and becomes more and more unaffordable, especially for lower-income households. From 2022 to 2024, Saskatoon's population has grown by 33,424 and is projected to continue to grow. Rental rates are also increasing, as the rates have increased by 38.1% in 2024. Today, the average cost of a one-bedroom unit in Saskatoon is $1,400 a month, but the average provincial support provided to individuals is less than half that amount. The Housing Needs Assessment report explains how there are two criteria that must be met to be considered core housing need. These are, quote, 1. A household's dwelling is below one or more of the adequate suitability or affordability standards. 2. The household would have to spend 30% or more of its before-tax income to access housing that meets all three standards, end quote. Additionally, this report also defines what is considered affordable, suitable, and adequate housing. Quote, housing is considered affordable when a household spends less than 30% of its before-tax income on housing costs. Suitable housing refers to accommodations with enough bedrooms to meet the needs of the household based on its size and composition. Adequate housing is defined as housing that does not require major repairs such as structural fixes, plumbing issues, or electrical work. End quote. The City of Saskatoon Needs Assessment found that a total of 11,115 households were considered in core housing need in Saskatoon back in 2021, with 73.5% being renters, which are more likely to also experience housing challenges. The results from this research project also found that affordable housing is not only poor quality, but often in unsafe areas with pest infestations that can commonly occur. This research project has found that policies can also impact homelessness in our community, as policies can be difficult to navigate and are often overlapping with one another. Changes to the Saskatchewan Income Support, SIS, and the Saskatchewan Assured Income for Disability, SAID, have proven especially difficult, with people making hard choices between paying for rent, feeding children, or paying for medications. Additionally, there's a lack of wraparound services that can support these individuals. There is also a lack of affordable housing units offered by Sask Housing Authority that can accommodate families. Now that we have a better understanding of homelessness, housing insecurity, and what it looks like in our community, we will now look at how evictions can contribute to this issue. Kenechukwu Anike is a research assistant at QSAR. He holds a Master's of Law degree from the University of Saskatchewan. Thank you very much, Kenechukwu, for being here today to discuss your work on evictions and why it matters when talking about homelessness. So, to get things started, what type of work are you doing?
First of all, thank you, Nicole, for having me. I am currently reviewing over 13,000 eviction cases from Saskatchewan's Office of Residential Tenancies, the ORT. I am trying to understand the eviction rates over the course of 12 years. That is from 2014 up until now, 2026. So far, I've reviewed over 1,000 cases from 2014 to early 2020. I also recently contributed to a QSA report that investigated how Saskatchewan's housing policies, programs, and laws manufacture homelessness in the province. I am going to be sharing some of the relevant findings here.
Wow, that is a lot of cases. Sounds like a very interesting and rigorous work. What is the process of evictions in Saskatchewan?
The eviction process appears to be a rather simple one for the landlords, and yet, in most cases, a complex one for tenants. The landlord is required under Saskatchewan's Residential Tenancies Act of 2006 to follow a legal procedure that involves issuing a termination of tenancy notice to the tenant, applying to the ORT for an order of possession, getting an order from the hearing officer, following up with that with the sheriff at the judicial center of their municipality for enforcement of the ORT order, and then appeals, where necessary. Where the landlord, issues a termination of tenancy notice to the tenant. Now, this is where the tenant is officially informed by the landlord of the landlord's intention to end the tenancy agreement with the tenant, and also the landlord's expectation that the tenant is to vacate the rental unit on or before the stated date on the notice. The notice usually states the reasons, in other words, the legal grounds for this, and it could be rent arrears, disturbance of others, damage to property, landlord's desire to personally use the rental unit, etc. Now, after that, and if the landlord applies to the ORT for an order of possession, where the tenant vacates, then there is no need for this particular stage. Otherwise, the tenant would be alleged to be overholding after service of a notice that terminated the tenancy, which then allows the landlord to apply for an order of possession from the ORT. The landlord and the tenant must then attend a hearing before an ORT hearing officer. The hearing officer could either dismiss the landlord's application or issue an eviction order, where the ORT hearing officer decides to dismiss the landlord's application. The tenant is not evicted, while where he decides to issue an eviction order, that facilitates the removal of the tenant according to the type of eviction order made. The eviction order could be immediate or delayed, and sometimes there might be no qualification of the order. That means there is no designation as to whether it's immediate or delayed. And as the name suggests, where an immediate order is made, it directs the sheriff to remove the tenant immediately, while a delayed eviction order fixes the removal at a future date. Now, the tenant, could appeal to the Court of King's Bench, but this rarely happens and can be quite challenging for people who are already faced with multiple barriers.
Okay. And how do evictions impact homelessness and housing insecurity in our community? How does it impact those people experiencing housing insecurity?
I'm going to, make reference to what you said earlier on. In 2022, a point-in-time count found 550 homeless people in Saskatoon. Now, this number went up in 2024 to 1,499, and last year, 2025, it still went up to 1,931. The top reason reported for these numbers that I just mentioned is evictions, which is, represents over 55% of the reason for, these things. Now, landlords enjoy a high success rate at the ORT, with most of the applications leading to evictions. This is due to an unequal playing field between the landlords and their tenants at the ORT, with 83% of the landlords' filings resulting in eviction. And this could be attributed to two significant reasons. One, non-attendance of the tenants at the ORT hearings, and no legal representation of the tenant. Let me also explain. The tenants rarely attend proceedings at the ORT. A review of 94 eviction cases from the ORT database revealed that tenants appeared in only 30 of those cases, representing 32%, and almost always faced immediate eviction orders when they don't appear to defend themselves. Eviction orders are usually secured on grounds of the sole evidence and claims of the landlord, and not necessarily based on the tenets of justice. Now, this leads to a one-sided factory-like process in favor of landlords, as most housing researchers would, put it, and who easily secure eviction orders that are often, homelessness sentences. Now, also, even when these tenants do appear, they are usually not conversant with the whole ORT process and are no match to the expertise of landlords' legal representation. This is due to the power differential between landlords and tenants, as most tenants cannot afford to have legal representation while the landlords can. This forces these tenants to give up the fight against their landlords, even when they have reasonable causes to challenge their landlord's case for eviction. What this means is that, the landlords have an easy run at securing eviction orders. It still doesn't end there. There are some post-eviction impacts, because upon the issuance of an eviction order, there is usually an urgent need for the tenants to move houses. However, the ORT publishes its decisions on CANLI. Now, CANLI is the Canadian Legal Information Institute. The ORT publishes its decisions there without blurring out the names of evicted tenants. What this does is that it stigmatizes these tenants, and it becomes harder to secure new housing due to the negative implications of the publication, has on their search for a new home. Now, this worsens their housing insecurity, as it becomes difficult for them to even transition to a secure housing, and as such, may end up facing either absolute or hidden homelessness.
And what are the evictions rates like in Saskatchewan?
Okay, so I've looked at 1,000, landlords applications, from the ORT from 2014 up till early 2020. And to my greatest surprise, 656 cases, representing 65.6%, got immediate eviction orders. And 188 of those cases, representing 18.8%, were delayed evictions. And 21 cases, representing 2.1%, were eviction orders without any designation as to whether they are immediate or delayed. And 135 cases, representing 13.5%, were dismissed.
And what supports are out there for people who might be going through this process?
All right. So the Community Legal Assistance Services for Saskatoon Inner City, otherwise known as CLASSIC, has a legal aid program via its walk-in advocacy clinic that provides advocacy services to eligible clients. Now, this includes free legal advice and representation in landlord-tenant issues for low-income clients of theirs.
And what do you think could help stop evictions from happening? What systems should be in place, or what other supports are needed?
First of all, we need to address housing affordability issues, and we also need to provide free legal aid to tenants, facing eviction proceedings at the ORT, and then we need to also prohibit the publication of the names of evicted tenants. Now, to further, amplify what I mean by this, one recurring reason for evictions is rent arrears, mostly due to housing unaffordability. So to address this, I will suggest the following, policy changes that will increase income and offer more protection to tenants to afford them the right to adequate housing in line with the National Housing Strategy Act. So first, we need to reassess housing support programs because the operationalization of the housing support programs, such as the Saskatchewan Income Support, otherwise known as SIS, it has adversely impacted the issue of homelessness and housing precarity in Saskatchewan. For instance, the Saskatchewan Landlord Association made a statement that, in quote, a month after SIS went into effect, over 31% of all SIS clients had not paid their rent, and another 18% were in arrears. End of quote. Now, this is due to the new SIS approach of not making direct payments to landlords, but to tenants who are usually left to make tough choices of either paying their rent or buying food. And also the amount paid out under the SIS program does not reflect the realities of the current housing market. And I believe that addressing these things that I've mentioned would help ensure that tenants are not in rent arrears and as such not evicted by their landlords. Also, we need to reintroduce rent control, because with the demand for housing continuing to outpace its supply, lack of rent control in Saskatchewan, simply means that the housing market will continue to remain in favor of the financialized landlords. And having rent control policies in place may reduce the negative impact of housing unaffordability on tenants. And then also, we need to offer social investment credits to housing investors, because housing unaffordability is propelled by the trend of financialization of housing that is deeply anchored on landlords seeing housing as an investment that ought to yield higher returns. So we just need to tackle financialization by projecting housing as a social good and rewarding housing investors that treat housing as such with social investment credits that they could leverage to market their businesses. And, with regard to provision of free legal aid, access to justice helps in sustaining security of tenure. And where this is undermined by lack of legal representation of tenants facing evictions, such tenants end up getting evicted, sometimes, if not most of the time, into homelessness. And then we should prohibit the publication of the names of evicted tenants, because the publishing of all eviction decisions on CANLI has the consequence of stigmatizing affected tenants, and it facilitates, both absolute and hidden homelessness.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing all your work and knowledge on evictions. It's quite remarkable, the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I would also like to thank our listeners for tuning in and supporting the podcast. So thanks again to everybody out there listening, and thank you for tuning in to Homelessness on the Prairie.